A poor student gave his lunch to a homeless man, never realizing he was the school's anonymous donor. That single act of kindness, born from the last scraps of Mason Wells' generosity, would alter the course of 2 lives forever. Mason hunched his shoulders against the bitter December wind as he trudged across the university campus. His threadbare coat, a second-hand purchase from 3 winters ago, did little to shield him from the biting cold that seemed determined to find every gap in the worn fabric. The weight of his backpack, heavy with borrowed textbooks, pressed against his aching shoulders. But it was the weight in his chest that truly burdened him. 2 missed rent payments, a final notice from the electric company, and now the campus job he'd been counting on had fallen through. The persistent gnawing in his stomach reminded him that he'd skipped breakfast, again, saving the single sandwich in his backpack for lunch. It was Thursday, and his next paycheck from the weekend diner job wouldn't arrive until Monday. 4 days to stretch his remaining $7. Around him, students laughed and chattered, rushing between classes with coffee cups in gloved hands, their faces flushed with cold but bright with the promise of upcoming winter break. Mason watched them through tired eyes, feeling the familiar wall of isolation that had become his constant companion. They existed in a different world, one where heating bills and grocery choices weren't life-altering decisions. Professor Harmon's economics lecture did little to distract Mason from his hunger. The irony wasn't lost on him, studying economic theories while his own financial reality crumbled. He sketched small, tight circles in the margin of his notebook, calculations of how to make it through the weekend if he cut back on the bus fare by walking the 3 miles to work. Remember, Professor Harmon said, closing his lecture, next week's final exam covers everything we've discussed this semester. The Callaway Scholarship applications are also due Monday, full tuition for next semester. I encourage those of you facing financial hardships to apply. Mason's pencil paused mid-circle. The Callaway Scholarship, the mysterious annual grant awarded to 5 deserving students, funded by an anonymous donor who'd appeared 3 years ago. He'd applied twice before without success. What were the odds a third time would be different? When class ended, Mason's phone vibrated with a text from his mother. "Sorry, honey. Can't send anything this month. Dad's medical bills came in. We'll figure something out. Love you." His thumb hovered over the screen. He wanted to ask for help, to admit how desperate things had become. Instead, he typed, "No problem. I'm doing fine. Love you too." The lie sat heavy in his chest as he pushed through the doors into the campus courtyard. The winter afternoon had grown darker, the air sharper. Snow had begun to fall in lazy, drifting flakes that caught in his dark hair and melted against his skin. That's when he noticed the man. Huddled on a bench near the philosophy building, the figure was bundled in layers of mismatched clothing. A gray beard, streaked with white, covered most of his weathered face. His hands, red and chapped, were wrapped around a paper cup that had long since lost its warmth. Something about the man's stillness, the dignity in his posture despite his circumstances, made Mason pause. Their eyes met briefly, the man's a startling, clear blue that seemed at odds with his worn appearance. He offered Mason a slight nod before looking away, as if embarrassed to be seen. Mason continued walking, making it halfway across the courtyard before stopping. His hand moved to his backpack, feeling the outline of his wrapped sandwich. His only meal until tomorrow. The hunger in his stomach protested loudly, but something stronger pulled at him. Before he could reconsider, Mason turned back. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the bench. "I thought you might want this." He held out the carefully wrapped sandwich, peanut butter and the last scraping of strawberry jam on slightly stale bread. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "That's kind of you, son, but I can't take your lunch." "Please," Mason insisted, the word carrying more weight than he intended. "I've got plenty." Another lie, but one that felt right. Something in the man's eyes suggested he saw through the falsehood, but he accepted the sandwich with careful hands. "Thank you. I'm Mason," he offered, not entirely sure why he was introducing himself to a homeless stranger. "Charles," the man replied, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth and clarity. "Here, Charles Finley." A gust of wind sent a shiver through Mason, and he pulled his inadequate coat tighter. "That coat's seen better days," Charles observed. Mason forced a smile. "It does the job." A third lie in as many minutes. Charles unwrapped the sandwich slowly, with deliberate care that made the simple food seem more valuable than it was. "Sometimes," he said, breaking the sandwich in half and extending a portion back to Mason, "sharing what little we have makes it more than enough." The unexpected gesture, this homeless man offering to share the very food Mason had just given him, created a lump in Mason's throat that he couldn't swallow past. Without a word, he accepted the half sandwich and sat down on the bench. They ate in companionable silence, watching the snow fall in thickening sheets across the campus. For the first time in months, the wall of isolation around Mason cracked, just slightly. What are you studying? Charles asked finally, brushing crumbs from his beard. Economics and business management, Mason replied. Though lately I've been wondering, what's the point? Losing faith in your choice? Mason shook his head. Not in the choice, in my ability to see it through. The admission slipped out before he could stop it, words he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. Charles nodded thoughtfully. The hardest journeys often lead to the most worthwhile destinations. Sounds like something from a fortune cookie, Mason said with a small laugh. Perhaps, Charles agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Or perhaps from someone who's walked a few difficult paths himself. The campus clock tower chimed, reminding Mason of his next class. He stood reluctantly. I should go. Of course, Charles nodded. Thank you for the lunch and the company. Same time tomorrow? The words surprised Mason as much as they seemed to surprise Charles. The older man's weathered face softened. I'd like that, though you shouldn't trouble yourself. It's no trouble, Mason said, and realized it was the first honest thing he'd said in the entire conversation. As promised, Mason returned the next day and the next, bringing whatever meager lunch he could assemble. Sometimes just an apple and a granola bar, once only a cup of hot tea from the free samples at the student union. Charles never commented on the humble offerings, accepting each with the same gratitude. More importantly, he listened as Mason gradually revealed the precarious state of his life. The juggling of bills, the dwindling bank account, the exhaustion of working weekends while maintaining his grades. Why economics? Charles asked one afternoon as they shared a day-old muffin Mason had rescued from the diner's discards. Mason traced patterns in the falling snow with the toe of his worn boot. My dad worked in a factory his whole life. Never complained, but I saw how it broke him down bit by bit. When he got sick 2 years ago, they let him go with barely any severance. I want to understand how money really works, not just for people like me, but for the ones who make the rules. To change the system from within, there was something in Charles's tone, not mockery, but genuine curiosity. Maybe, or at least to protect my family from it. Mason glanced at Charles. Juanma, what about you? What did you do? Before? Charles's eyes took on a distant quality. I built things. Companies, mostly. What happened? The older man shrugged, his layers of mismatched clothing shifting like tectonic plates. Life. Choices. Some good, some terrible. He offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But that's a story for another day. Over the weekend, Mason worked double shifts at the diner, his fingers chapped and raw from hot water and harsh cleaning chemicals. He set aside half his tips, just enough to cover the minimum payment on his electric bill, and used the remainder to buy 2 real sandwiches from the grocery store. One for himself, one for Charles. Monday morning brought freezing rain instead of snow. Mason hurried across campus, his backpack protected under his coat while he himself was soaked through. The Callaway Scholarship application, completed during breaks at the diner, was safely tucked inside a plastic folder. His last hope for the next semester. Charles wasn't at their usual bench. Mason waited, the cold seeping into his bones, until he could wait no longer without being late for class. He left one sandwich wrapped carefully and tucked partially under the bench, protected from the rain by the seat, where Charles might find it. Professor Harmon collected the scholarship applications at the beginning of class, his eyes lingering briefly on Mason's damp appearance. The committee will review these over the next 2 weeks, he announced. Results will be posted before the holiday break. Mason nodded, trying to ignore how his wet jeans clung uncomfortably to his legs, how the other students subtly shifted away from the puddle forming beneath his chair. 2 more weeks of uncertainty. 2 more weeks of stretching every dollar to its breaking point. When class ended, Mason checked the bench again. The sandwich was gone, but Charles was still absent. A twinge of worry threaded through him. Where did Charles go when he wasn't on this bench? Did he have anywhere to shelter from this freezing rain? 3 days passed with no sign of Charles. Mason continued to leave half his lunch at the bench, and each day it disappeared, though he never saw who took it. By Friday, genuine concern had settled into Mason's chest. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the campus maintenance staff had begun setting up for the annual Winter Charity Gala, a lavish fundraising event that always struck Mason as obscenely opulent compared to the struggles of students like himself. The Callaway Foundation's Winter Gala. Read a banner being hung across the main administrative building, celebrating 3 years of educational opportunity. Mason paused, watching workers in heavy coats securing the banner against the wind. The Callaway Foundation funded the scholarship he'd applied for. The mysterious donor who remained anonymous even to the university president, according to campus rumors. Some said it was an elderly alumnus, others a tech billionaire with a secret past at the school. Mason had never given the donor much thought. The money was what mattered, not who provided it. Quite the spectacle, isn't it? Mason turned to find Professor Harmon beside him, hands deep in the pockets of his wool overcoat. "I suppose," Mason replied, "though it seems like a lot of expense just to give away scholarship money." Professor Harmon chuckled. "The wealthy have their own ways of doing things. But the Callaway donor is different from most, insists on total anonymity, minimal administrative costs, and maximum impact for students in need." He glanced at Mason. "You're looking particularly exhausted today, Mr. Wells. Everything all right?" The unexpected concern in his professor's voice nearly unraveled Mason's carefully maintained composure. "I'm fine, sir. Just worried about a friend I haven't seen in a few days." "Anyone I might know?" Mason shook his head. "Just someone who spends time on campus. Older gentleman named Charles." Something flickered across Professor Harmon's face. So quickly Mason thought he might have imagined it. "I see. Well, I hope your friend turns up soon." "Thank you, sir." Mason hoisted his backpack higher on his shoulder. "I should get to work." The weekend passed in a blur of exhaustion. The diner was short-staffed, and Mason picked up extra hours that left his feet throbbing and his back aching, but put an additional $70 in his pocket, enough to make the minimum payment on his rent and buy groceries for the week. Small victories. Monday brought clear skies and biting cold. Mason wrapped his scarf, another second-hand purchase, twice around his neck as he approached their bench. His heart lifted at the sight of a familiar figure, bundled against the cold. "Shush, that's Charles." The relief in his voice surprised even Mason. The older man looked up, a smile breaking through his beard. "Mason, I was hoping you'd come by." "Where have you been?" "I was worried." Charles's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Were you now?" "I'm touched." He patted the space beside him. "I had some business to attend to. Nothing for you to worry about." Mason sat, pulling a thermos from his backpack. "I brought hot soup today. Figured we could both use it. Your generosity continues to humble me," Charles said, accepting the cup Mason poured for him. His hands, Mason noticed, looked cleaner than usual, the nails trimmed neatly. They sipped the soup in companionable silence before Charles spoke again. "Finals week soon, isn't it?" Mason nodded. "Economics on Wednesday, business ethics on Thursday. And that scholarship you mentioned? When will you hear about that?" "Sometime this week, supposedly." Mason stared into his soup. "Not that I'm getting my hopes up. There are hundreds of applicants." Charles studied him over the rim of his cup. "You never told me why you need it so badly." Mason hesitated, then decided there was little point in pride anymore. "I can't afford next semester without it. I've stretched every loan, every grant, every favor from family. There's nothing left to squeeze." He looked away, focusing on a distant tree rather than meet Charles's eyes. "I'll have to drop out, at least temporarily. Try to work full-time, save up, maybe try again next year." "What would an extra semester mean to you? Besides the obvious continuation of your education?" The question caught Mason off guard. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that he hadn't considered the larger meaning. "It would mean," he began slowly, "that all the sacrifices weren't for nothing. That my parents' pride in me isn't misplaced. That maybe there's a path forward after all." Charles nodded thoughtfully, his blue eyes distant. "Paths forward," he murmured. "They rarely look like what we expect." The conversation shifted to lighter topics. A book Charles had recently read, found discarded in the university library, a particularly difficult concept from Mason's economics textbook that Charles surprisingly helped clarify with remarkable insight. As Mason prepared to leave for his afternoon class, Charles reached into his layers of clothing and withdrew a small, worn book. "I want you to have this," he said, holding it out. Mason accepted it cautiously. "Man's Search for Meaning" by Viktor Frankl. The cover was faded, the pages yellowed with age. "It helped me once," Charles said simply. "During a time when I'd lost my way completely." "I can't take this," Mason protested. "It obviously means a lot to you." Charles shook his head. "Books are meant to be passed on when the time is right." "The time is right." Touched and slightly confused, Mason carefully placed the book in his backpack. "Thank you. I'll return it when I've finished." No need, Charles said with an enigmatic smile. Consider it yours now. That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Mason began reading the book. Frankel's account of finding meaning in the midst of suffering in Nazi concentration camps struck a chord deeper than Mason had expected. His own struggles, while real, seemed to shrink in perspective against such profound resilience. He read until his eyes burned, falling asleep with the book open on his chest. The next morning, Mason woke to an email notification. Callaway Scholarship Decisions, early notification. His heart hammering, he opened the message. Dictat to dear Mr. Wells, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a recipient of the Callaway Scholarship for the upcoming semester. This scholarship will cover your full tuition and includes a stipend for books and basic living expenses. Mason read the email 3 times, disbelief gradually giving way to a joy so intense it brought tears to his eyes. He wanted to call his parents, to shout from his apartment window, but most of all, he wanted to tell Charles. He rushed through his morning routine, skipping breakfast in his hurry to reach campus. The usual bench was empty. Mason waited through his free period, then reluctantly headed to class, planning to return afterward. Professor Harmon was collecting final exam materials when Mason entered the classroom. Ah, Mr. Wells, I believe congratulations are in order. Thank you, sir, Mason said, unable to suppress his smile. I still can't believe it. The committee was particularly impressed with your personal statement, Professor Harmon said. Not many students articulate such a clear vision for how they intend to use their education to benefit others. Mason took his seat, the professor's words warming him further. He'd written about his father's experience, about economic systems that discarded people when they were most vulnerable, about his determination to create more equitable business models. The exam consumed the next 2 hours, but Mason approached it with a clarity and confidence he hadn't felt in months. The crushing weight of financial anxiety had lifted, allowing his mind to engage fully with the material he'd studied so diligently. After turning in his exam, Mason hurried back to the bench. Still no Charles. He waited until darkness began to fall, the winter night coming early, before reluctantly heading to his apartment. He'd try again tomorrow. But tomorrow brought the same result, and the next day, and the day after that. Charles had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared in Mason's life. Even the sandwich Mason left went untouched, eventually becoming a sad, frozen lump that a campus maintenance worker disposed of. By the time Mason completed his final exam on Thursday, a hollow feeling had formed alongside his scholarship joy. He wanted to share his good news, to thank Charles for his unexpected friendship during the darkest period of his life. The book Charles had given him had become a talisman of sorts, carried in his backpack wherever he went. Friday afternoon found Mason once more at the empty bench, watching workers making final preparations for the Callaway Foundation's Winter Gala that evening. The event was for major donors and university officials only, with scholarship recipients invited for a brief recognition ceremony at the beginning. Mason had initially planned to skip it. The thought of standing among wealthy benefactors in his worn clothes made his stomach clench. But now, staring at the empty bench where he'd shared so many conversations with Charles, he reconsidered. Perhaps attending would honor the strange friendship that had sustained him, acknowledge the unexpected kindness that had entered his life when he most needed it. Decision made, Mason hurried to his apartment to prepare. His options were limited. The same dark slacks he wore for diner shifts, freshly washed, his one button-down shirt, slightly wrinkled but passable, and a tie borrowed from his roommate, who was already gone for winter break. He polished his worn dress shoes as best he could and trimmed his hair with kitchen scissors, studying the result in the bathroom mirror. The young man who looked back at him seemed different somehow. Still thin, still bearing the shadows of exhaustion under his eyes, but standing straighter. More present. The Winter Gala transformed the university's grand hall into a winter wonderland of silver and blue. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ice sculptures and elaborate floral arrangements. Waitstaff in formal attire circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Mason stood awkwardly near the entrance, his scholarship invitation clutched in his hand. The other recipients had already gathered in a small cluster near the stage, their attire ranging from business casual to surprisingly formal. Before he could join them, Professor Harmon appeared at his side. Mr. Wells, I'm glad you decided to attend. The professor was immaculate in a tailored tuxedo. The recognition ceremony will begin shortly. The donor's representative will present the certificates. Representative? Mason asked. I thought no one knew who the donor was. Professor Harmon's eyes twinkled. Well, someone must handle the practical matters. The Callaway Foundation has a board of directors, though they respect their founder's wish for anonymity. He glanced at his watch. "Ah, it's time. Please join the others by the stage." As Mason moved through the crowd, he felt a strange, prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He turned, scanning the elegant gathering, but saw only unfamiliar faces engaged in conversation. The university president took the stage, tapping a microphone to gather everyone's attention. "Welcome, distinguished guests, to the 3rd Annual Callaway Foundation Winter Gala. We are honored to recognize this year's scholarship recipients, 5 exceptional students who embody the values of academic excellence, perseverance, and commitment to community that the Callaway Foundation seeks to foster." Mason stood with the other recipients as their names were called, each stepping forward to accept a certificate from a distinguished-looking woman introduced as the Foundation's executive director. When his turn came, Mason moved to the center of the stage, blinking against the bright lights. Mason Wells, the president announced, a junior in economics and business management, recognized for his academic achievement despite significant personal challenges and for his commitment to creating more equitable business models. As the executive director handed him the certificate, she leaned close and whispered, "He would be proud of you." Before Mason could ask what she meant, she had moved on to the next recipient. Following the ceremony, the scholars were free to enjoy the gala or depart as they chose. Most of Mason's fellow recipients gravitated toward the elaborate buffet, but Mason found himself wandering the perimeter of the room, still searching for a face he knew wouldn't be there. Looking for someone? Mason turned to find Professor Harmon beside him again, offering a flute of champagne. "No, I mean, yes, but..." Mason accepted the glass awkwardly. "It's silly. I keep expecting to see my friend Charles here. The gentleman you mentioned earlier this week?" Professor Harmon's expression was unreadable. "Why would he be at a university fundraiser?" Mason shook his head. "I don't know. Like I said, it's silly." He took a sip of champagne, the bubbles unfamiliar on his tongue. "I just wish I could thank him. He disappeared right after I got the scholarship news." Professor Harmon was quiet for a moment, studying Mason with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Finally, he said, "Perhaps you'd like to see something interesting. A bit of university history." Confused but intrigued, Mason followed the professor out of the main hall and down a corridor to a wing he'd never entered before. They stopped before a wall of portraits, previous university presidents and notable alumni, their serious faces staring down from ornate frames. "The university's legacy wall," Professor Harmon explained, gesturing to the portraits. "Some of our most distinguished graduates." Mason scanned the solemn faces politely, wondering why the professor had brought him here. His gaze stopped abruptly on a portrait near the end of the row. A younger man with neatly trimmed dark hair streaked with premature gray, clean-shaven but with unmistakable features, sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes, startlingly blue eyes that Mason had seen before, across a bench in the campus courtyard. "That's..." Mason began, stepping closer to read the nameplate. "Charles Finley, class of 1978, Chief Executive Officer of Finley Innovations. Benefactor." He turned to Professor Harmon, confusion evident on his face. "I don't understand." The professor's expression softened. "Charles Finley was one of our most successful alumni, built a tech empire from nothing, became a billionaire by 40, then lost everything, his company, his family, his reputation, in a scandal involving financial misconduct by his board of directors. Though later cleared of wrongdoing, the experience changed him profoundly." Mason stared at the portrait, connections forming in his mind but seeming too impossible to articulate. 3 years ago, Professor Harmon continued quietly, "Mr. Finley approached the university with an unusual proposition. He would establish a foundation to provide full scholarships to students in financial need, with one condition: his identity as the donor must remain completely anonymous." "The Callaway Foundation?" Mason whispered. "But why Callaway?" "His mother's maiden name." Professor Harmon's voice was gentle now. "Charles Finley disappeared from public life after establishing the foundation. There were rumors he'd moved abroad, or to a remote mountain retreat." The professor paused. "I never expected to find him living on the streets of his alma mater." Mason's mind was spinning, pieces falling into place. The way Charles had helped him understand complex economic concepts, his insight into business ethics, the careful way he'd observed the scholarship preparations. "Why would a billionaire live as a homeless man?" Mason asked, his voice barely audible. "That," said Professor Harmon, "is something only Charles could explain. Though I suspect it has something to do with finding what truly matters after losing everything." He placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. What I do know is that last week he came to my office. Clean-shaven, properly dressed, though not nearly as affluent as in his CEO days. He asked about you. Mason's heart stuttered. About me? He wanted to know if your scholarship application showed promise. I told him that the committee makes those decisions independently, as he had originally requested. Professor Harmon smiled slightly. He seemed satisfied with that answer. Where is he now? The professor shook his head. He didn't say, but he left something for you, in case you came looking for answers. From his pocket, he withdrew a sealed envelope and handed it to Mason. Mason stared at his name written in a neat, precise hand on the front of the envelope. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Dear Mason, by now, Professor Harmon has likely explained who I am, or rather, who I was. I apologize for the deception, though I never actually lied to you. I did build companies. Life and choices did lead me to that bench. What I didn't tell you was how sitting on that bench for the past 3 years has taught me more about humanity than my decades in boardrooms. I've watched thousands of students walk by. Some avoided looking at me entirely. Others tossed spare change without meeting my eyes. A few stopped to talk briefly, their discomfort evident. Only you shared your lunch when you yourself were hungry. I established the Callaway Foundation after losing everything that I thought defined me. Wealth, status, identity. I hoped that by giving anonymously, I might find meaning again. Instead, I found only a hollow satisfaction in distant charity. Until you sat beside me and shared half a peanut butter sandwich. Your scholarship was awarded on merit alone. I have never interfered with the committee's selections. But your kindness gave me something no money could buy. A reminder of genuine human connection, freely given without expectation of return. The book I gave you helped me rebuild my life after my fall from grace. Perhaps its message will serve you as well. Meaning comes not from success or recognition, but from how we respond to life's challenges and how we connect with others in our shared humanity. I've decided it's time to stop hiding and start living again, though differently than before. I've accepted a position teaching business ethics at a small college upstate. A fitting next chapter, I think. Your coat, by the way, is entirely inadequate for winter. You'll find a replacement at the campus lost and found. Your size, I believe. An anonymous donation. With gratitude and respect, Charles Finley. Mason lowered the letter, tears blurring his vision. The champagne in his other hand trembled, sending ripples across its golden surface. He's gone then? He asked, his voice thick. Professor Harmon nodded. For now, but people have a way of returning to places where they found meaning. Mason carefully refolded the letter and placed it in his pocket, next to the small book that had taken on even greater significance. The hollow feeling that had plagued him since Charles's disappearance began to fill with something warm and substantial. Not just gratitude, but understanding. Thank you for showing me this, he said to Professor Harmon. I should go. The gala's barely begun, the professor protested mildly. Mason smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. I have somewhere I need to be. He left the grand hall, the sounds of celebration fading behind him as he stepped into the cold winter night. The campus was quiet, most students already gone for break. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting in the golden light of the lampposts. Mason made his way to the familiar bench, now dusted with fresh snow. He brushed a space clear and sat down, looking out at the campus that had become more than just a place of education. Charles Finley, billionaire turned homeless man turned teacher, had given him more than a scholarship. He'd given him a lesson in seeing beyond appearances, in finding connection in unexpected places, in the profound impact of small kindnesses. Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew Charles's book. Opening to where he'd left off, he began to read by the light of the nearby lamppost, the snow falling gently around him. In the distance, the sounds of the gala continued, celebrating wealth and opportunity. But here on this simple bench, Mason had found something rarer and more valuable. A moment of clarity about what truly mattered. The path forward wouldn't be easy. Financial struggles wouldn't magically disappear. But something fundamental had shifted in Mason's understanding of success and purpose. It wasn't about escaping hardship, but about finding meaning within it. About recognizing that sometimes the most significant connections come disguised as chance encounters. About how sharing what little we have can make it more than enough. As the snow continued to fall, Mason closed the book and looked up at the night sky, where stars were beginning to appear between breaks in the clouds. Somewhere upstate, Charles Finley was starting a new chapter, and here Mason Wells was doing the same. He stood brushing snow from his borrowed tie and secondhand slacks, Tomorrow he would check the lost and found for the coat Charles mentioned. He would call his parents with his scholarship news. He would begin planning for a future that now seemed possible again. But tonight he would simply walk home through the falling snow, carrying with him the warmth of a connection that had transformed him in ways no scholarship ever could. A poor student had given his lunch to a homeless man, never realizing he was the school's anonymous donor. But in the end, the greater gift had been the one Mason received. A reminder that in our most vulnerable moments, the humanity we extend to others ultimately reveals our own.